we are not in as bad of a situation that we were in 5 years ago, just to put things in perspective. So we are seeing a structural decline in demand for gas overall in Europe. We have, to a certain extent, managed to diversify our source of supply and also managed to reduce our overall consumption. Nuclear is also another interesting story. It's extension rather than building new traditional nuclear plants. We still haven't seen any substantial projects breaking ground on that.
Oil and gas prices have surged once again. Events outside of Europe are feeding straight into the continent's economy. There is no immediate supply crunch, according to Brussels, but there is a very real question about resilience. So, has Europe genuinely made itself safer to energy shocks since the Ukraine war, or is it still too exposed when global markets panic?
In terms of Europe energy security, it's essentially a gas question, right? So from where we were, for example, if we are comparing the situation to the invasion of Ukraine in 2022, I would say we are in a much better position because when we just look at our dependence on gas, for example, 5 years ago, we were reliant on a single source, which is Russian pipeline gas, for about 40% of our domestic gas demand in Europe, whereas today, this reliance has dropped to around 6%. So from that perspective, then we had one single big source of supply, but right now it's a lot more diversified to LNG. And when it comes to LNG, it's a global market. So there's going to be supply and demand factor, and it's ultimately a global market. So yes, the facility in Qatar went down, but ultimately that supply is going to be filled by other sources of LNG coming from the US, for example. So we are not in as bad of a situation that we were in 5 years ago, just to put things in perspective.
And to be in a better position than we were 5 years ago, that's obviously a step in the right direction. But the conversation at the time was, a big part of it at least, was about energy independence. Is Europe energy independent now?
That's a good question. I mean, if we think about what we define as energy independence, I would assume energy independence is a state of being self-sustainable with less reliance on imported fossil fuels. So if we define it as such a way, we are less dependent on fossil fuel today because if we just look at, say, power sector alone, we are now generating power from renewables, solar and wind for about 40%. That's a rough annual average in markets like Great Britain and Germany. And this used to be around 25% 5 years ago. So when we have more cheaper sources of renewable supply, it also reduces our reliance on gas and imported fuel for power generation. And this is also a similar story across other sectors. I mean, obviously, there are industries, there's story behind residential sector. So for industries, our gas demand in Europe has fallen by about 30% compared to our past 5-year average. So we are seeing a structural decline in demand for gas overall in Europe. So from that perspective, we have, to a certain extent, managed to diversify our source of supply and also managed to reduce our overall consumption when it comes to gas. And that comes from one of the anchoring policy support that was rolled out in 2022, Repower EU, which actually focused on exactly these measures that I mentioned, diversifying our supply source and reducing your reliance on gas across various sectors.
Okay. Brussels has said that there's no immediate supply emergency, but at the same time, storage is much lower than a year ago and refill risks are rising. Is Europe as resilient as the EU Commission would have us think?
In terms of resilience, it depends on how far this crisis, if we can call it a crisis, is going to last. When we look at right now, we are entering the spring season. So from a power markets perspective, spring is a season where we are the least reliant on gas. So your demand for gas is going to be very low because, again, you have low power demand. Heating needs are reducing because temperatures getting warmer. So people turn down their heaters at home. So from that perspective, your power demand's reducing. And similarly, it coincides with a time where your renewables supply is ramping up. So with longer daylight hours, you have more solar power generation. So a lot of solar and lower power demand means the market is loose when it comes to supply and demand dynamics in the power market. So that means we are well positioned to sort of ride off this short term, and by short term, I'm saying the spring and summer ahead. But if this crisis lasts longer than that, when we are entering the cooling season during midsummer, and then when we are entering winter, that is something that we should still be thinking about, because we are still reliant on gas um, for other sectors, and also for power sector as well in winter. So yeah, it depends on the timeline.
So that's the big kind of broad overview. But of course, not all European countries are exposed in the same kind of way. And I think, for example, about Germany, which has struggled, especially in any energy intensive industries, since having to move away from cheap sources of Russian fossil fuels. So, how would you describe that kind of difference in how different parts of Europe are affected? Who's going to be hit hardest by the current price rises?
Yeah. So markets that are hit harder includes markets that are still reliant on gas for bulk of their um, either domestic gas generation or in the power sector, or for their industries. And these includes Italy. I would say is most exposed, because when we look at the power sector alone, Italy relies on gas to supply almost 40 to 50% of its power generation annually. And also, Italy is more reliant on LNG gas. So when we are looking at power prices, Italy's power prices are more reactive. It has gone up a lot more in the past couple of weeks since the war broke out. And we also see other markets at the opposite end of the spectrum, markets like Spain and France. So, for context, Spain also relies on gas, but to a much lesser extent. Spain is a market that has seen an extremely fast growth when it comes to solar deployment in recent years. So that has really helped it to reduce its reliance on gas. So now it's dominated by renewables most often, and it does rely on gas during winter. And France also, it has a big nuclear fleet, so nuclear helps to cushion the gas demand. So these markets are least impacted. Germany and Great Britain, somewhere in between. These markets are still reliant on gas. Germany is an interesting example here, because it still has a coal fleet to rely on. So since the war broke out, we have actually seen a lot of gas to coal fuel switching. And if you've been tracking the story of coal in Europe, it's a bit of a sad story, right? Because there is legislation that's going to ensure these power plants are closing, and there are also economic factors that reduce running hour of coal plants, because it's really expensive with carbon prices increasing. So there's just no economic incentive for coal plants to run. But since the war broke out, because gas prices are now really high, so it has incentivized coal power plants to come back into the market, and they're now in the money, so they're running. So Germany sort of have this cushion with coal plants in between, helping to absorb some of the shock. Whereas Great Britain is different in the sense that it shut off its last coal plant a couple of years back. So now it has like renewables and gas.
But wouldn't you theoretically, of course, want Spain generating more solar, which can go to countries that are more exposed? I mean, this integrated power market exists in theory, but does it work like that in practice?
To a certain extent. I mean, there are situations where there's interconnector bottlenecks and constraints around how much power can be exported or imported from a certain region to the other. I mean, of course, France and Spain has interconnectors, but it's not as much it's not big enough to completely see a convergence in prices of these two markets. So that's one technical constraint. And also we have to think about the wider infrastructure. And when I say wider infrastructure, things like grids. And we are talking about scaling up renewables, but we also need to scale up our grid infrastructure to absorb all of that surplus energy that's coming onto the grid. So that's another more important part of the conversation. But again, in BNF, we track investments in clean energy, and we have been tracking lots of investments going into grids and the clean energy sector alone. So there is movement in the right direction.
But what about nuclear energy? It seems that Germany, in a lot of ways, is kicking itself for abandoning it. Friedrich Merz, the chancellor here in Germany, has said that there's no going back on nuclear. Yet at the same time, the EU Commission seems to be pushing for a particular kind, the small modular reactors. What's your take?
So nuclear is also another interesting story. So right now there has been a lot of announcements on SMR, or small modular nuclear reactors. But we haven't really seen like a commercial viable project that's been approved in Europe, I would say.
Mm.
And a lot of the current nuclear power plants, what we are seeing is tracking a trend of extending the current fleets. For example, Belgium reactors got a 10 years extension, and Spain is considering a similar move. It has one power plant, Almaraz, coming to retirement in 2027. So there are ongoing discussions on whether that can be extended. So a lot of the direction is towards extension rather than building new traditional nuclear plants. And there are announcements on SMRs, but we still haven't seen any substantial projects breaking ground on that
Right.
end yet.
You've been watching a sneak preview of our business podcast, The Dip, where we follow money stories that cross borders.
And if you want more, you can scan the QR code that's appearing on your screen right now.
We'll be back with more, same time, same place next week. Until then, thanks for watching The Dip.